Hey folks, Fernando doing another video for more survivalists, and in this case talking about knife maintenance, cleaning, and some of the common myths floating around that are not really that much of a good idea, but some people put them to practice with greater or lesser success. And let's get to it right away. Basically, the first thing we want to notice is what kind of steel are you talking about that you have in your knife. Typically, you hear a lot of survival experts, I guess, say that you want to have a carbon steel knife. And that's cute, it's nice, but you know, carbon steel is pretty much all steels have carbon in them. If not, they would not be steel at all. It is true that you have, you know, different degrees, and there's a point at which we start talking about stainless steels, which have an amount of stain resistance and rust resistance that is beyond what you would expect from a more traditional carbon steel. Usually it's like 0.5, 0.55 content of carbon in the steel. Is higher than that, it's considered, you know, that's lower than that is considered stainless. It is true though that you have some very good stainless steels that have a lot of carbon in them, as much as your typical 1095. So it's not just about the carbon; it's about how resistant it is to corrosion or not. Now, to keep things simple and not too complicated, basically your carbon steel is going to be visibly rusting rather easily. Your typical 1095, that would be a classic carbon steel, and yes, when exposed to humidity, water, and so on, it will rust with a certain ease. Is that the end of the world? Of course not. I have the K-bar here, one of the more legendary knives. This is 1095 steel, and yes, it had rusted, and yes, I have cleaned it, still perfectly fine. Not the end of the world. Having said that, I've had one case specifically. I remember I forgot a pocket knife, one of these French, I don't even remember the name, but the typical little wooden handle a pocket knife made in France. I forgot one of those that went into the washing machine, and when I got it out, it was ruined. It was an orange mess of rust. So it can happen, and in certain survival situations, it could be that you're wet, that you fall into water, you just don't have the your cleaning supplies for maintaining things properly. I think that the ideal steel for a survival knife will have to be some variety, some higher end stainless steel. That's personally what I went for with my own survival knife. This is the survival knife I designed for Aitor, made in Spain, quality manufacturer, N680 boiler stainless steel. It's a tough steel. It's tougher than 1095. It holds an edge longer than 1095, and it does not rust because it's one of the most rust and corrosion resistant steels there is, along with the one that Spyderco uses in the Salt series, which is H1, H2. Anyway, Spyderco uses two steels for their saltwater knives. One of those is this one, N680, and yeah, I like it also. That it's very tough, holds an edge very well, and for those reasons I went with that. I have even the prototype. This one was made with N690, which is very similar to N680, but look at this thing. Even though it's went through a good amount of use and quite a bit of abuse as well, there's really nothing going on there. Now, when you're looking at a carbon steel knife, you will realize that most people don't even use their knives, and I'll be the first one to raise his hand. I barely use a minimal fraction of my knife collection because I have hundreds of them. I could not possibly use all the knives I have, and you usually stick to a few favorites. One of my favorites is actually this one, the Glock knife. I love it. I think it's a great knife. I use this quite a bit, but given the materials that I personally selected for the construction of this knife is not showing much, because it is very resistant to any kind of use, and the micarta handles are also super tough as well. So in the case of the Glock, yeah, you'll start seeing that, coating, peeling, and so on. In the case of Glock, even though it's 1095, they do some kind of treatment underneath the black paint, because this part, even though it peeled off, it doesn't rust nearly as much as the edge, which is more exposed metal. Not a big deal. You just clean it and so on. But when it comes to a survival knife, part of that is usually going to be involving maybe some kind of food preparation. That is where having a clean knife may make the difference between you getting sick and ending up throwing up or diarrhea or what God knows what else, or avoiding that. The nice thing about a stainless steel knife is that it's not only very easy to keep it super clean, it's also not going to be, gathering gunk and trash and crap all over the blade, and it's also going to be sliding through whatever you're cutting with minimal friction. That's another advantage that it has. When you have the typical, I don't even have one here, but the typical survival knife that is on the $100 or $200 range, depending on how much marketing the brand has going, it's going to be a 1095 with some kind of textured epoxy paint on top. As soon as that epoxy paint peels off, and it will if you start using it, you're going to be looking at either maintaining the knife or having that thing rust on you, and that's going to be creating more friction. In the case of Glock, the paint they do, because Glock is Glock, it is minimal friction that it has. That's nice. Even when it's coming off like that, you're still having all of this stuff. It's more spots where crap and gunk and so on can gather. One of the things that some people think is, oh, I'll just use some olive oil. That's food oil, so this is good. Well, it's good and not so good at the same time. You could even use animal fat, for example. This is a knife I made myself many years ago. Nothing to it, just a very simple knife, but it is a carbon steel blade that rusts super easy. I mean, every time I use it and left it in a toolbox, I ended up finding it pretty rusty. Now, for a long time, this is a knife that I use for a number of asados, barbecues. It's an insult to call an asado a barbecue. In an asado, a traditional Argentine barbecue, you actually use real chunks of animals, not just burgers and hot dogs. So there's a lot of fat involved, and there's a lot of cutting large pieces of animal involved, and with that fat that's left on the blade, you can just wipe it clean and just leave that little layer of fatty coating from the meat itself, and it's going to be doing a surprisingly good job at preventing rust appearing. Now, I will also say this: those fatty acids, animal or vegetable, like the ones that you have in olive oil or any other vegetable oil, will start pitting, and they're going to be leaving somewhat of a patina on the blade, which looks nice, but eventually, and you see a little bit of that there, and you see a lot more of that over here. This is what eventually is going to be happening. The more this happens, the more it starts pitting and doing these little holes, because that has the fatty acids will corrode eventually. It's not going to be ruining your blade overnight. You're probably not even going to be alive to see this happen, because this knife is definitely over 100 years old. This one is not, but a little bit of a patina you do see, and you start seeing those little spots. How you prevent that? Super easy. You just clean your knife after using, and you use a little bit of good old mineral oil. Pure mineral oil is the more simple, cheapest, best solution you have. You have some commercial stuff around. I mean, even the ballast oil, which again, it's mostly, mineral oil, and it's going to be tasting not so pleasant, but you could use this. But my advice is just stick to that 100% pure mineral oil, a little bit of coat on that, or if you're looking at a survival knife and yes, the price is a factor. Now, I will also say this: I see a lot of fancy brand name survival knives that are not nearly as good as my knife, and they're using a 1095 blade with a couple of slabs on the side. The price of the steel is a factor. 1095 is the cheapest steel in the market. I know that for a fact because I was involved in the construction of my own knife. And when Aitor was, hey, well, we could use 1095. It's something people like it, sure, but it's not what I would consider like my version of an ideal survival knife. As an ideal survival knife for me would be something like this, with a high-end, high quality stainless steel knife that is as tough and tougher than your 1095, holds an edge better, and besides that, I don't even have to worry about rust. You look at what U.S. military does with their M9 NATO, M9 bayonet, and kind of the same logic. You're using stainless steel, and yes, this is a lot cheaper stainless steel. It's actually, again, the cheapest stainless steel there is. 420HC is what they use. But even the cheapest stainless steel, when heat treated properly, will do its job. But obviously, they've decided we don't want something that could, end up being an orange mess of a rusty blade when not cared for. And you don't know how things are going to be playing out. Maybe it's months later or even years later that someone needs a knife that was neglected for how long, and you avoid that sort of thing. Now, you also have to admit that a 1095 blade, like my beloved K-bar knife here, even if it rusts, you clean it. And, very rarely will a knife be destroyed by rust. It's very uncommon. A little bit of rust, sure, you clean it and it's just fine. If you want to have a layer of something that's going to be keeping that knife safe for a long period of time, then I would advise using what I have here in this K-bar, which is calcium grease. You have food-grade calcium grease, which is safe if that knife is going to be used maybe for something in contact with food or something like that. And besides that, it stays a lot more than your mineral oil. The mineral oil will run, and you'll have to recoat the blade eventually. And yes, you always have to do that eventually. But with calcium grease, this stays in place a lot longer. So for something like a collector's piece, something like this knife, a little bit of calcium grease is a lot better. Or if you have a survival knife that you just appreciate a lot, and you want your carbon steel survival knife to be ready for whenever you need it, but you're not constantly looking, checking, and using it, again, this would be what I do. A little bit of calcium grease, food grade calcium grease in your carbon steel survival knife. That's going to be protecting it quite nicely and be ready for whenever you need it. Folks, that's going to be all for now. Remember that if you're interested in these topics, you have my books available in the Amazon links below. And regarding street survival skills, I did talk a little bit about maintenance of knives, guns, and so on with improvised methods. You have bugging out and relocating, and you have surviving the economic collapse available in the links below. Take care. See you in the next video. Have a great one.